So the Taylor family has a number of movies that are family favorites that we like to watch on a fairly regular basis, one of which happens to be The Princess Bride. And so I was watching this little video that was explaining some of the history of the making of the movie. And one of the things in it that I thought was particularly interesting is that the most popular scene in the whole movie, which is only like maybe on screen for 5 minutes, was the most expensive to film and took the longest, and that was the scene with Billy Crystal playing Miracle Max. And the reason why it became that was because right before they did the first take, the director, Rob Reiner, whispered to Billy, "Forget the script, just say whatever you want." And of course then, what was supposed to be maybe 5 hours of filming on one day turned into 10 hours a day for 3 days before they could get it done, because this guy, and he had decided that he was going to do what he called medieval Yiddish stand-up. That was his name for it. He gave a picture of Casey Stengel, the old ball player, and his grandmother to the makeup artist, and he goes, "Do something that's a combination of this." And he proceeded, every single take, he completely delivered totally different lines. Nobody knew what he was going to say next. And so one by one, they started banishing people from the set. They banished the director because he kept ruining takes by laughing so loud. And then they started banishing the actors. Finally, the actor who's mostly dead they got rid of him and they just put in a dummy to lay there for him. There was only one actor who was the swordsman. He had to stay there on set, and he was the only one who experienced any injuries in the making of the movie because he was trying not to laugh and ruin the scenes. And so that's how that thing went. And they gave special honors to the actress who played Miracle Max's wife, because she had to come out and she had to respond to his ad-libs with her own ad-libs in order to keep it in character and to keep it going straight. So that was the history of that particular movie. And that ended up being the inspiration for the title of the message, which is Mostly Dead. The church isn't completely dead, or some churches, they're just mostly dead. And as Miracle Max says, I've seen worse. And so God has seen worse. So a church can literally be down to 2 people. And I know of a church that was down to 2 people, and the church came back to life and ended up being a church of hundreds of people, because it went from being mostly dead to being completely alive. And so that brings us to the key question: how does a dying church come back to life? And because it happens. And it happens more frequently than we realize. Sometimes churches just do completely die. They close the doors and they're done. And that has to be a choice of God. There must be a reason why God allows that to happen. But then God stays with a faithful remnant in a church. And in time, God brings that church back to vibrant life again. And so that's one of the things that we want to consider in the message today, is how does a dying church come back to life? The key idea for this is that Christ brings life when you bring Jesus. Are you following that? Christ brings life when you bring Jesus. This puts you on the spot, so you just need to remember that's what this is for, which is what the God sighting is for. Why does this matter? It matters because you know people who don't know Jesus. There are going to be people in your life. They may be just people that you work with. They may be just, your next door neighbor. They may be a family member. They may be a friend or the spouse of a friend. But the fact is, you know people who don't know Jesus. So therefore, when you bring Jesus, Christ brings them life. It all ties together. So our sermon passage today is Acts chapter 9, verses 32 through 42. That's on page 778 of the Pew Bible. And that's where we're going to be. Now, I gave a disclaimer. I've expanded the disclaimer this week. Last week, the disclaimer was very short and to the point. I've had to add a little bit because history is a description. It's not a prescription. That's what I had last week. This week, I added that history is a description that teaches principles, not a description to duplicate. So we're even going to see things in today's passage, and God is not going to ask us to duplicate those very things. He's going to ask us to look at the principles that are being shown and then apply those principles to how we live today. So that's why the more in-depth disclaimer is necessary. So starting in verse 32, it says, "Meanwhile, Peter traveled from place to place, and he came down to visit the believers in the town of," I'm going to call it Lydda because I don't know. "And there he met a maid named Aeneas, who had been paralyzed and bedridden for 8 years. Peter said to him, 'Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your sleeping mat.' And he was healed instantly." So one of the things that I highlighted that Jesus Christ heals you is the fact that Peter may have gone there, and it may have looked to people like Peter was doing the healing, but Peter makes sure that he makes it clear that he may just be coming in the name of Christ, but when he comes, it's Christ who's doing the work. He's not doing the work. And so I think the principle here is that we have to recognize when we are doing things to make a difference, to serve people, and to help and come alongside and encourage them. When we do that, we need to make sure that they know that we are there in the name of Jesus, that it is God who is sending the help to them. And then he says to get up because faith requires a response. One of the things that I think is interesting, I didn't highlight it, but it says roll up your sleeping mat. Because this is a guy who has been crippled for years, and since he's been crippled, he hasn't been able to get up and do anything. So he's been spending all day, every day, for many years, hanging out on a sleeping mat. So Peter is telling him, you need to roll that up. That isn't necessary anymore. It's the middle of the day. You can be up doing things. You can be living a productive, active life. You don't need to stay in bed. You can be done with that. So the get up means you're not just getting up, you are leaving behind the evidence of your problem. God has healed you, so now you have to live as a person who has been healed. Verse 35, "And then the whole population of Lydda and Sharon saw Aeneas walking around, and they turned to God." So this is the other part of what's going on, is that when God has done something in our lives, we're not supposed to keep it a deep, dark secret. We're supposed to share it and talk about it and tell people what God has been doing. Not just in church. That's a great place because it encourages and builds up the body of believers. This really does make a difference for us. But the idea is that we draw attention to what God has done, and then when people can see that God is doing miraculous things in our own life, look at what it says. The God sighting produces faith. That's why I've renamed the testimony to God sighting, because God sightings produce faith. When people see the evidence of God having worked, that encourages them to turn to the Lord. So you want to start living a life, because this is the part that we're going to imitate. We're going to be living a life where we actually share what God is doing in our life. It's not going to look like what happened to Aeneas. It's not going to look like what Peter did, because this is historical account. This is just showing us what happened. The principle is that we are going to make ourselves available to God and serve others as God gives us opportunity and as God speaks to our heart and tells us what to do, just as he has done with Peter here. And then the people that we have helped are going to then be able to talk about it. And so when God has done something in your life, you don't keep it a deep, dark secret. This isn't like, when you become engaged and you don't want anybody to know that you're engaged, and you don't want anybody to know that you're in love, and you want to keep it a secret, and you want to go off somewhere and in secret get married and never have any. Has anybody ever done that? What would that be if you were wanting to get married to somebody and they told you, well, I'll marry you, I just don't want anybody to know that we're married. I want to keep this a secret. You'd feel like, well, what kind of relationship is this? There's something wrong here. Well, you know what? God has the same attitude. It's like, I'm here. I'm showing you love. I'm forgiving you of sins. I'm giving you new life. I'm even making a difference in your life here and now. And I'm doing this. And what? You don't want anybody to know it's me who's doing it? You say that you love me, and then you're keeping me a secret? God, that's not the way he wants us to be. That's why things like this are in the scripture. It's supposed to inform us that we should be honest and open about it. Verse 36. There was a believer in Joppa named Tabitha, which is Greek for Dorcas. She was always doing kind things for others and helping the poor. About this time, she became ill and died. Her body was washed for burial and laid in an upstairs room. So here we have this description. You got to ask, it's like, okay, why are we given this description of her heart, the nature of who she is as a person? That seems to be important that we're getting this. But the idea of death is that her problem is beyond anything that the world can do. And we understand that. We realize that when somebody has died, the most we can do is to prepare them for burial. That's the only option that we have. Short of God doing a miracle, there's nothing that you and I are able to do. Verse 38. But the believers had heard that Peter was nearby in Lydda, and so they sent 2 men to beg him, please come as soon as possible. So it makes you kind of wonder, what have they heard about Peter? Do they have a misunderstanding? Do they think that somehow Peter has powers and abilities that normal humans don't have? Is that what they've heard? Or are they like so many people? I encounter this because I'm a pastor. People say, will you pray for me? In other words, what they're saying is, you have a direct line to God. And if you pray for me, God will actually pay attention, and he might actually answer the prayer and do what I need to have done. So would you do that? Is that what people are doing? Are they looking to Peter because they think that Peter, well, let's face it, he did walk around with Jesus for 3 years. He learned from him. Upon this rock I will build my church. Jesus said that to him. Have they heard these things? Do they somehow believe that he's in tight with Christ in a way that nobody else can be? Do they misunderstand this? We don't know. All we know is that they've heard where he is. They've got a problem. They figure, call him. He can solve the problem for them. Verse 39. So Peter returned with them, and as soon as he arrived, they took him to the upstairs room. The room was filled with widows who were weeping and showing him coats and other clothes Dorcas had made for them. So my question here is, why is it important for Peter to know the heart of Tabitha and to see the people's love? Why? And when I say love, it's their grief. So they're grieving in love here. Why is it important for Peter to know this? And I can only theorize on this. I can't know for sure. But I do know that there is something that happens in me, and I suspect it probably happens in others as well, that when you know a situation about a person, you know their nature, you know that they are loving people who are always sacrificing themselves for somebody else, when you know what they're experiencing, when you know what they mean to people, when you know what their loss means to somebody. Let's face it, when we understand these things, it affects us in our own heart. It's just the way it is. And I will say that when your heart has been affected, you do pray with more fervency and more passion when you do that. So that's possible that that's the reason why Peter needs to know this, but we don't know for sure. Going on in verse 40, but Peter asked them all to leave the room, and then he knelt and prayed. Turning to the body, he said, "Get up, Tabitha." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. So we know that he's praying something, and it's powerful. It's powerful. We know that because she comes back to life. I think it's interesting that he asks everybody to leave the room. And one of the reasons why I think, there again it doesn't say this, I think that he asked them all to leave is probably for two reasons. And I have a feeling, because I see a white dot on there, that we're going to be having a discussion of why did Peter tell Tabitha to get up. Okay, that's a little bit beyond me. I forgot where I was going. But I do think that two reasons why he asks everybody to leave. Not everybody who is in that room is a follower of Jesus. There were people who were not followers and not believers who were there. And so therefore, he is not providing entertainment. Miracles are not there to have people go, whoa, like they've gone to see a great magic act and they're looking at the illusions and things go poof and happen, and they get all excited about that, and they, well, how do you do that? He's there to serve God. The last thing he needs is to have people who are whispering and talking and carrying on and crying and sobbing. He wants to completely put all of his attention on the situation at hand. And he wants to have an undisturbed conversation with God, because that's what prayer is. And he needs that. There are times when we should be praying with other people because it helps us to learn their heart. And then we also discover things that they choose to pray that we've never even thought of that cause us to go, well, that's something else. Yeah, that's worthy of praying for. That's when people start saying things like amen, because it's saying something that they agree with that they never even imagined. There's a time for that. And then there's a time when we need to pray in solitude without any distractions, where we can focus. And I think that's really what's going on there, is that he needs to do that. We won't get into why he tells Tabitha to get up, but that'll be one of the discussions that we have when we get together on Thursday for Soulflex. Verse 41, he gave her his hand and helped her up. Then he called in the widows and all the believers. You see, this is why I said that he didn't have everybody in the room was not a believer. The widows and all the believers, and he presented her to them alive. In other words, God had done the miracle. I have no idea what kind of a conversation that Peter had before he went to see Tabitha. I can only imagine that he needed to know from God, God, are you having me go here because you're going to do a miracle? Are you going to bring this person back to life? I truly believe that he needs to have God tell him what's going to happen next. He needs to know that this is what God wants him to do. I think he needs that. I know that, when people have different kinds of gifts like that, they get a message from God telling them exactly what God wants them to do and why, when, and where, and they have a sense of this, and they know that they're getting a message from God. So I do believe that Peter got a message from God telling him, well, number one, to go, and number two, to pray, and then to say, get up, because that was when he was going to see that God had actually done the miracle, because how would he know that God has done the miracle until he himself has seen the evidence? And now he presents her to them alive. So now he is basically saying, this is the miracle. God has done this miraculous thing. And because he does this in obedience to God, and because the miracle has been done by God, and because the people are presented with the reality of the miracle, then we get to verse 42. The news spread through the whole town, and many believed in the Lord. So what's happening here is that when news of what God is doing spreads, people become interested and they choose to believe and follow Jesus. So therefore, whatever we can share about our experiences with God, they make a difference in the lives of somebody else. Now, it may not be one of those things that, you might say, I don't have anything great to share. I mean, I can't share this great miracle like what Peter had where she came to life. But there's another thing that happens, which is when one person shares what God has done in their life that they think might be small and unimportant, another person shares what God has done in their life. This sharing has an accumulative effect where people start going, you know what? Those Christians, they keep having these experiences with God. I hear it here, I hear it there, I hear it everywhere I go. It adds up. I'm taking a medication right now because I have this horrible after effect from one of my radiation experiences. And one of the things I've learned of this, because it's supposed to help me with my nerves, and because I have pain. And one of the things that I learned is that it can take anywhere from 1 week to 2 months for the medication to take hold and actually have its full effect on me so that I'm not feeling the pain. I actually feel less pain today than I have. But in the middle of the day, I'll be doing something and the pain will start to increase and then it'll start to wane again. Why do I tell you this? I tell you this because it's exactly what I'm saying about your testimony of your God sightings and the next guy's God sightings and the next person's God sightings. It may take a long time of people hearing these reports of God being present and God doing things in people's lives until they start going, okay, I think there's some credibility here. I keep hearing about it over and over again. So just as this medication, I have to keep taking it relentlessly, even though it feels like it's not really doing that much, and I have to be patient, I'm telling you that when you share what God is doing, don't expect that all of a sudden people are going to just like jump up and go, there, I've heard it, I have to believe. Recognize that that is just one little dose of God's presence, and it adds up. And with the next person and the next person and the next person, it adds up. And eventually they come to the place where they go, this is irrefutable. Everybody's experiencing stuff. The Christians who truly trust and truly believe and truly obey and truly share, those people are experiencing something. That's what I want. I want to be at a place where I can say, I truly believe. They won't get there because you shared once. They won't get there because one person shared once. They get there because we keep sharing again and again and again. And when we truly believe, and when we truly live it, and when we truly share it, that is when a church which is small and tiny like ours, a church that some people ask, is this a dying church? That's what makes a church come alive and grow again. This is what makes it happen. It doesn't make it happen because I preach brilliant sermons. I'm not saying that I preach brilliant sermons, but maybe, no. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that the preaching, well, it has to be solid from the Bible, and it has to be solid on the gospel. While it has to be that, that is not enough. What makes a church alive and vibrant is when the people in the church truly embrace what God is doing in their life, and they make it known and they share it. That's such an important part. We have gotten over the centuries into this idea where it's the clergy who stands up front and does everything and everybody sits and relaxes. That was never God's intent for his church. It was always his intent that all of us as believers would come in and we would all share with each other and we would all hold each other up and we would all encourage each other. And because we are all active in the work of the church is truly alive. And you can see it by the way the church grows. So what's our truth nugget? When you bring Jesus, you bring life. That's it. You've got to see it. When you bring Jesus, you bring life. And that's why it's so important that we participate in the time of God sightings. So the takeaway, this is where you ask God for help. Lord, help me to be comfortable talking about you so that others will believe. If you feel shy, if you feel embarrassed, if you feel like I could never do this, it's not that you can't do it. You might say, yeah, but that's not my personality. It's not who I am. No, that's how you become. You can ask God for help. It's just like people who have anxiety and won't go out in public. There are some people who will never ask God to help them deal with their anxiety so that they can live a full life like others. And then there are people who ask God for help. They receive the help, and they end up living like they have no anxiety. It doesn't mean that they don't have anxiety. It just means that when you see them out doing things, they're doing it by the power of God. They're not doing it by their own power, because by their own power, they would stay huddled inside where they wouldn't be around somebody. It makes a difference. And so what I'm telling you is that when it comes to talking about your faith, when it comes to making sure that other people can see and know about the ways in which you have experienced God, even if that is not part of what you think is your nature, you can ask God to help you, and He will help you. You know, you would think that because I stand up here or sit up here and talk all the time, that this is just the most natural thing in the world. You have no idea how filled with anxiety I was when I first started doing this. How much, I would just, I don't know if you've ever heard of people who have such stage fright that they just, want to throw up and be sick. I never did that, but I'll tell you, I understand when people talk about that, because I would have to tell you how uncomfortable I used to be. When I worked in radio, I could work in a studio because nobody could see me. All I had was the microphone, and I could talk and I could do what I needed to do, but nobody would see me. To have people see me was something that was very uncomfortable. When I accepted Jesus, there came a point where I realized that God wanted me to be baptized. I kept not going forward to ask to be baptized. I kept not doing it. I was so petrified of standing up in front of a room full of people and having people see me and have people know where I was at and what I wanted. I was just really, really uncomfortable. You might think, oh, but Brad, you stand up and you talk all the time. Well, that's just because God helped me through that. To be honest, if it was left up to me to sit quietly and to listen to other people talk, unless I'm in a room where there's just me and one or two other people, which I feel very comfortable talking there, and I can talk your ear off. But when it's a large room, I would much rather just be silent and let everybody else do the talking and not have me do the talking. When I finally walked forward to be baptized, I was telling the people who I was sitting with on either side of me in the church, I'm going to step forward and get and ask to be baptized today. I had to say that to a couple people that I knew and felt comfortable with, because once it was off my lips, and once they knew, I knew when it got time for the invitation in that church that they would all be looking at me. And I needed that, because if it was left up to me with no other expectation on me, I would have just sat there yet another week as I had done all of the previous weeks. So what I'm telling you is, if you think that sharing and talking about your experiences with God, and if you think, well, that's just not me, remember, you're not the only one who has felt this way. And if God can help me do what I do now, then God can help you to share one of your God sightings. That's something that you would be able to do.